From the day in New London, Connecticut, I'm Carlos Virgen, and this is Case Unsolved. This week, we bring you a bonus episode on the William C. Spicer Jr. case. Over the last two episodes, we brought you the story of his life, murder, and legacy. Since producing the last two episodes, we've gotten a few questions from listeners and learned some new details about the murder investigation, including that Bill Spicer's body was exhumed 4 months after the murder. I'm in our studio with reporter Erica Moser. Erica, what do we know about the exhumation?
So, as we mentioned briefly in the last episode, we got a tip about 2 weeks ago that police had to exhume Bill Spicer's body to obtain his fingerprints, and we confirmed that with police. Since last week, we've kind of gotten a trickle of more information, so we're here kind of to show you some of our reporting in process. And when we had found out that police had exhumed Bill Spicer's body for his fingerprints, we had some more questions, obviously, like when did this happen and how long are fingerprints viable for after a body is buried, and why did police not have the fingerprints before the burial? So since last week, we heard back from Detective Heather Beauchamp that the date of the exhumation was July 14th of 1995, so that's 4 months after the murder.
And typically, police would want the murder victim's fingerprints to exclude them from any other fingerprints found at the crime scene, right?
Yes, and the State Police Major Crime Unit helped out the Groton Town Police Department in collecting evidence at the scene. As we've said in past reporting, police can't get into specifics about the evidence that they found, but Detective Beauchamp did note that by the time evidence is sent to the lab and analyzed, it can be months before results come back, so it's not necessarily like they had all this evidence and we're just waiting for the fingerprints. So we don't know kind of whatever point evidence came back.
Did she say anything else about taking fingerprints?
Yeah, Detective Beauchamp said that taking fingerprints is standard practice for any autopsy when it's a criminal investigation, and for some reason it just wasn't done. She did note that she doesn't know what standard practice was back then, and she said that she couldn't comment on why the fingerprints weren't taken before Bill Spicer was buried. And just to be clear here, for Detective Beauchamp, not knowing standard practice or not being able to comment, she was in high school in 1995, so it's not like she was even remotely involved in this investigation back then.
Did we talk to anyone else in law enforcement that was involved in the case at the time?
That has been tough. I was messaging back and forth with Worley Smith, who no longer lives in the area, but was detective lieutenant at the time of Bill Spicer's death in March of 1995. He declined to do an interview and referred the case on to the investigators now, and he said he doesn't even recall what was done at the autopsy or what kind of evidence the State Police Major Crime Unit collected. And also, Worley Smith retired in April of 95, so the month after the murder, so he wasn't even involved with police at the time of the exhumation.
So then who oversaw the detective division after him?
That was John Graves. I first had seen his name in our clips several months after the murder, and so I reached out to him last year, I think it was November, and I talked to him over the phone briefly, but he declined to participate in the podcast and referred our questions to other investigators. He did say that he took over as head of the detective division about 10 days after the murder. So after we had learned about the fingerprints and the exhumation, I did place a couple voicemails with him again, but we haven't heard back.
And we talked to retired officers Matthew Morton and John Varone previously on the podcast. What about them?
Matt Morton said he was on medical leave at the time of the murder, but he figured that not getting fingerprints upon the death was probably an oversight at the time. John Varone was a patrol officer until he became a detective in December of 96, and he said he didn't know why the body had to be exhumed.
So this question about taking fingerprints from a buried body, how do we know how viable it is for that to happen and how long fingerprints are viable after a body is buried?
That's something I'm not sure. I don't have a personal knowledge of much about burial practices and exhumations. But in general, it does depend on a lot of factors. I do know that family had Bill Spicer's body embalmed in case police needed to do an exhumation for more evidence. I was emailing back and forth with Bill Spicer's daughter, Doris Pulaski, but she didn't want to sit down for an interview because it's just too painful for her to talk about. I also reached out to John McDougall, funeral director at Biles McDougall Funeral Service in New London, and he wrote back to me saying that he lost his voice, so that email was the best option to answer my questions. And so I was particularly interested in talking to him because he was at Sparkle Lake Christmas Tree Farm the night of the murder to remove Bill Spicer's body.
Right. So we know from previous reporting in the day that police got a call reporting that a man was dead inside his car at Sparkle Lake Christmas Tree Farm. They got the call around 8 p.m. So what time do we know that John McDougall showed up that night? And what did he say about what he saw?
John remembers showing up around 1 a.m. And he said that while other details of the murder and the investigation later are blurrier to him, he vividly remembers, even 23 years later, showing up at the scene to remove the body. He said that the area was not roped off at the time because the death was not yet considered a homicide. He said that Bill Spicer was wearing one of those wool, red and black checkered outdoorsman coats, and as far as he could remember or he could see, there wasn't any blood visible on the front of the coat. So from what he and police had seen, it first appeared that Bill Spicer had had a heart attack at the wheel or had somehow died of natural causes. But John McDougall said that when he reached his arm behind Bill Spicer's shoulders to pull out his torso, that he felt something wet. So he pulled his arm out and saw that it was all bloody. He said that he called police over, and they then switched gears to treating this as a crime scene. So John left and then came back several hours later to then remove the body.
So, talking about removing the bodies from crime scenes, what's the system and has it changed?
It has changed, is what John was telling me. He said that now at crime scenes, the medical examiner's office will send their own people down to remove a body back to their offices in Farmington for the autopsy, and that when the autopsy is complete, the funeral homes will go to Farmington to retrieve the bodies. And it's been years since funeral homes stopped going to crime scenes. But one thing John McDougall said hasn't changed in the 41 years he's spent with the funeral home is fingerprints being taken before a body is released to a funeral home. He said he has no idea why fingerprints weren't taken at the time unless it was strictly an oversight.
So who was in the medical examiner's office at the time of the murder?
John said that Dr. Boris Pouquet, associate medical examiner at the time, was at the scene before he was. I'm not sure about what his involvement in his work there was later. I did look up Dr. Boris Pouquet, and I found that he had died in 2010. The chief medical examiner at the time is still alive. That's Dr. H. Wayne Carver. And we're still trying to get in touch with him to see what, if anything, he could tell us. And if we learn any more significant information or get some more interviews, we'll be back in your feeds.
If you have a tip about William C. Spicer Jr.'s murder, please contact the Groton Town Police at 860-441-6716 or the New London State's Attorney's Office at 860-443-2835. If you have any questions about the Spicer case, post it on our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/caseunsolved or email us at caseunsolved@theday.com. Just a reminder to rate and review Case Unsolved on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use, as that helps people find our podcast. Case Unsolved is produced by Peter Wappy and me, Carlos Vidgen. Reporting was done by Erica Moser. Editing and audio mixing by Peter Wappy. Tim Cotter is executive producer, and Sassy Larrañeta is associate producer. I produced the music used in the series. This has been a production of The Day in New London, Connecticut.